Welcome to our Living Stones podcast, where we gather to discuss all matters of faith and life as members of God's household. In a world that often leaves us feeling fragmented and disconnected, our hope is that Living Stones will help to further connect us as we pursue the Lord together. I'm your host, Davina, and welcome to a new season of Living Stones. Today, we have a special lineup for you, our very own elders, Elder Daniel Lee, Wooj Cho, and Pastor Paul Bain, to talk about the heart and the value of our one church, two congregations approach. We're going to be talking about what we're currently experiencing, our Korean ministry and our English ministry swapping service times. So, yeah, let's get started. Thank you guys for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Elder Daniel, you are our newest guest on our show. So I would like for you to introduce yourself a little bit for those that may not be familiar with who you are, how long you've been at our church, your background in our church, and how you serve today, maybe?
Sure. Well, good to meet everybody over the radio broadcast.
Radio.
Yeah. My generation. My generation.
This is
My
a
generation. So, Daniel Lee, I was a youth group member of the church about 35 years ago.
Wow.
And I guess grew up at the church, went to college, left the city and area. I lived in Boston and Texas and other places, and came back to church in 2009. And then ended up becoming an elder on the KM side. Happily married to my wife, Amanda, and have 4 kids, Rachel, Samuel, Anna, and Elizabeth, 25, 24, 23, and 13-year-old.
Wow.
All doing very well in God's grace. Well, I guess nice meeting you, and thanks for having me today.
Yeah. I actually went on our Colville missions trip with you, I think once or twice.
3 times, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
You have
3 times.
Great memory. But yeah, if you ever get to know Elder Daniel, he is the most chipper, always smiling, always so positive type of guy, and one of the elders at on our KM side.
Yeah. Can you tell it to my wife?
Yeah, I have a fond memory of Elder Daniel. I as most of our members should know by now, I moved to Nova in 2009. That's when I started serving at the church. And I think a few months later, Elder Daniel, or at the time just Daniel and Amanda, showed up to one of our services. And I didn't know his background at all. So I saw them for a few weeks. And then I guess, they felt probably too old because there really was no one even close to their age. They're 20 years senior at the time of everyone else. And then I realized that they moved over to KM and started to really serve the KM community. So they ended up being the oldest in the EM to the youngest in the KM.
Yeah.
But they had family there and such. So, and then learning about the history was kind of fun. And he is, I think, one of the most, like you said, chipper characters
Yeah.
that I know. I would say he's very humble and willing to serve the church in any way possible. Yeah, so I really respect him. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pastor Paul.
Okay, you hear that, Amanda?
I'll make sure to have a listen to that, yes.
Well, I'll send a link to her.
Okay.
I think it's also worth noting that Elder Daniel, at least since we've gone to this kind of joint EM, KM session model, and I've come on board as an EM elder, I always look at Elder Daniel as kind of like our bridge a little bit, partly because he's bilingual. He has a lot of familiarity with the States, and so he's been an ally in that way. And so I think that's why he's a good candidate to be here to kind of explain things from the KM side and understand our history too. Also, it's worth noting, I think all your kids came through our youth group, right? And members at one point at least of our EM ministry as well. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's so neat. It is, as you were saying, I think this lineup is perfect for the topic that we're going to discuss because everyone here are elders. And we have, Elder Daniel, who's from the KM side, so we can have a very holistic understanding of what's going on right now with the transition and our church history because then, you are the longest standing member of this church.
There probably would be other people.
On today.
On today.
Yeah.
Today, yes.
On this panel.
Right.
Yes.
So just brief history side, I think our church was founded in 1965. So next year will be our 60th anniversary.
Wow.
So that's a big deal. So we're thinking about celebrating in the proper way next year.
Yeah, I was reminded the longest or the oldest Korean Presbyterian church in the area. I think in terms of Korean church itself, the third oldest.
That's correct.
You have like a Methodist church and a Baptist church that were,
Yeah.
prior to us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So like, church with that kind of long history had ups and downs, but I think I feel like exciting time to be at our church because of the partnership with EM and KM together, and then kind of like being able to serve wider congregational needs at the same time. So just very blessed to be part of the process.
Nice. Yeah, so you just touched on the beginnings of the history, like when our church was founded. I think when I came up with these questions, it was important to me to help the audience kind of understand how we are at this point with KM. So could you share a little bit of, let's just start at like when EM started becoming established. When did that happen and how did the relationship kind of unfold?
So Pastor Paul will cover that. But before we do, can I share one interesting data point?
Yeah, of course.
So I oversee church finance as a finance elder. I dig up this old kind of offering record dated August 31st, 2008. So that was before Pastor Paul's time. EM congregation member attendance, 15 people. And offering total $30 was what we had before. So that's how we started the EM ministry back then. And when Pastor Paul came a year later, 2009, a lot of things were beginning to change.
Actually, do you even know when an EM ministry started?
So as far as I recollect, I wasn't here at that time, but our college ministry somehow became EM after that point. And then even when I was a youth group student, there were like always some attempts to formalize EM congregation as a separate ministry, etc. But then due to the, I guess, lack of leadership, no dedicated pastor for that congregation, it really didn't materialize. So it was at the best possible way, like extended youth ministry in a way,
Yeah.
but it never became EM, at least when I was here before Pastor Paul arrived.
Nice.
Yeah. So I tried to dig up some history because when the EM ministry started or when the EM started, and I couldn't find anything documented when I got here. And so I started recording the history starting from 2009. But I did learn by asking people, like, were there any, prior EM pastors? And I heard of my, direct predecessor, Pastor Justin. He was serving for about, 2 years or so. But prior to him, I was told that there were several. And so when we're talking about EM pastor, we're talking like youth/EM, basically, what Elder Daniel was describing. So you had actually a total of 7 people that's been. No, well, there was a guy named Chris Cho, Timothy O, Ryu, I don't know his last name, David On, Tepe, Matthew Lee, Justin Kim. They're all part of the church history.
These were youth pastors.
I think youth/EM pastors. They've served at some point. I don't know exactly the year because, again, it's not recorded. But, yeah. And so I think the offering total that Elder Daniel cited, that was probably right after Pastor Justin left, I'm assuming. And so there was a void there. And so members are probably just kind of in limbo. Yeah.
Perhaps, yeah.
But in terms of, I guess, to respond directly to your question, Davina, you wanted to know how the EM and KM decided to partner. I'm just afraid that the episode would be, become too long if I went into all the details. But let me try to sum it up. I'll try to be as, I guess, succinct as possible. So I joined in 2009, and what made that year interesting was Pastor Park, our senior pastor, came a month after me. So we, entered the scene without knowing each other and without really knowing the history of the church all that well. It was Pastor Park's first senior pastor position, and he really had no experience dealing with an EM guy directly. And so that first year was very difficult for both of us. And I do think there was a lack of clarity as to what our relationship was going to look like. And so we were both navigating through that. And I think at one point, and a lot happened in that first year because things had to be defined for us to move forward. And so the main question posed to the elders at the time was, what are we? What do we want to be? The question was very, was very clear and direct, and they had to offer a response, right? And so, I mean, the choices were basically, did we want to be ODPC or at least follow that model, one church, two congregation, or do we want to become like the KCPC, CCPC partnership that eventually, you have a church, mother church birthing, a church plant, and then, CCPC particularizing, as we say, becoming its own entity. And so that question was posed, and very early on, I believe in that same year, the elders responded with, we want to follow the ODPC model. And so once that was made clear, it was just a matter of putting all the pieces together and holding them accountable to that vision. Because, it was my first sort of lead pastor position, but I wasn't a young guy, at least in my mind, and I've seen enough happen in the Korean church that I knew that talk is cheap. I wasn't simply going to be content with, oh yeah, we want to be one church. I wanted to make sure that real action was taken to back that up. So I think things from there became, okay, what does that mean? And well, for me, it meant amending our bylaws, okay, so that our actual, the way we do church together, like legally, would reflect that vision. And that took some time because we really had no leverage at the time. Our offering was $30, as Elder Daniel said, in 2008. And when I first got there, I think our first Sunday offering was $400. So we had no leverage in terms of like people or resources. And it made sense. We were still like acting or living like children. So we had to grow up first, and that took time. But once we showed some maturity and growth and responsibility, that's when Cam was able to take us more seriously and say, okay, we have this vision. Now we're willing to partner together as co-laborers, not one lording it over the other. But I think one other thing I can add to this sort of initial response is Pastor Park also had, I guess Pastor Park first had to be convinced that this was the right path to go. And I believe he was really wrestling that first year. But one thing that helped was both of us going to ODPC. They held this one-day conference for churches like us, where we were trying to figuring out how to do one church together as KM and EM, and they provided some resources. They provided some space for the senior pastor to come with the EM pastor into dialogue, and also to hear from the ODPC leadership how they were able to do it, right? And so that was very helpful. And we had very candid conversations there, and that was maybe that meeting itself. Perhaps I believe it had at least 15 couples. Couples meeting senior pastor EM pairs, 15 pairs, and it was a pretty intimate setting, but very I would say very instrumental in shaping our church. And so I feel partly indebted to John Cha. At least in those initial years, he offered a lot of help and support, and did his best to respond to all my questions.
Thank you for answering that first part of the question, where the two congregations, one church, right, approach was established. You're saying the year that you came to our church in 2009?
Yeah, at least the initial vision, it was defined, right? But there were small pieces that later became realized. I would say like the bylaw amendment, it was done maybe 2-3 years after the fact. Okay. Giving EM financial autonomy, that also came later. Allowing the EM to elect their own officers, deacons, that came later. And so there were these benchmarks that we had to meet. But it wasn't just, okay, EM, we treat you as partners, so you do whatever you want. It wasn't like that. It was, okay, show responsibility first, and then once you do so, you can do this and then next. So I think it was very organic, as we love to say here.
Yes, very.
But
I think what might be helpful really quickly is to for shaping this discussion is maybe describe those benchmarks. Like, for example, when were you a member of the session as an associate pastor? What year was that? Maybe when did you stand up the steering team? Which maybe we can do a brief summary of that. I think these were the benchmarks to show what Pastor Paul said was the maturation of our ministry. When do we elect our first deacons? And then obviously, I think it was 2001. When do we elect the elders?
Not 2001.
I think that was 2021.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I did a little bit of homework before I got here, but that was
Just the key
2021.
points.
But yeah, I think maybe it might take a little time to answer all this question because I have to look it up. But I would say for us, even naming our ministry Cornerstone, it took a little bit of effort because the CAM elders were reluctant to allow us to, I guess, redefine ourselves because there was lack of trust. They didn't fully trust me, which is understandable, I guess, given that there were a lot of turnover. EM pastors coming and going, and they also know of EM pastors that took the EM away from the church, I guess. And I mean, they themselves experienced a lot of church splits, right? So lack of trust led to suspicion. But I had to, I guess, request a special meeting, and I pleaded with the KM elders at the time, and they graciously allowed us to sort of redefine ourselves. I thought that was an important moment. That happened in July of 2009. So I came in end of March, and after a few months of back and forth, they allowed that name change to happen in July. I think another thing I remember is when I first got here, the worship was combined, youth and EM together. I strongly felt like if we wanted to grow as an EM, not only do we have to define ourselves in name, but also give ourselves a separate space to grow, and not be looked upon as a glorified youth ministry, as is commonly said. So I think that was important because, again, there were more youth members than EM members early on. And so when someone walked in, they'd be like, okay, this is a sort of a youth group. So that perception had to change. And I think that another key point, I believe, was when we started marrying people. So, June and Miriam was the first couple. That was July. And then we had Casey and Hannah in August of that same year. And I think once we, so Jason and Erica married in the following year. So there were some key weddings there, and they constituted our early leadership, and so that was important. And in 2011, I have in my notes here, our worship service moved to 9:30 a.m. from 12:30, and so imagine so. Initially, our EM service was during the most undesirable times during lunch hour, 12:30, and then I forget all the details there, but I did specifically record it that this was an important thing. In 2011, January, worship service moved to 9:30 a.m. Okay, and so there's that. What other thing did you mention, Elder Wooj?
When did you become a member of the session?
Okay.
I think that's significant. Right. We don't have to go too far into it, but the way I also look at it is, one of the things is a Presbyterian church. They're governed by the panel of elders, obviously, right? That's what makes the PCA unique. But in order to grow, there has to be essentially multiple people growing the ministry together. And even though Pastor Paul was so pivotal in leading the charge, and he many times he was probably felt like the lone ranger in that regard, I think he understood that he needed to kind of mature us together, right? So I think it was maybe 2013, 2014, he stood up what was called like the steering team. And it was like it wasn't even deacons at the time. Probably it was like men, like staff people, some of the key leaders that Pastor Paul had just mentioned. Eventually, it morphed into when we elected our, I don't know if elected is the right word, ordained our first deacons, June in DC. And then they became the steering team. And then when I became a deacon, that steering team enlarged. And it was essentially a group that Pastor Paul could, share ministry duties towards, commission us towards, but also he would kind of ask us for our thoughts on ministry decisions, right? This is an absence of our own session. And at that time, Pastor Paul was the lone member of the KM session as an EM member, being an...
Okay, so I found the dates there. So January of 2012, okay, we appointed 17 deacons. So these are not ordained deacons. So these are sort of deacons in a very loose sense. Okay, 17 appointed deacons, but 6 of them were asked to serve as part of our steering team. That was sort of our leadership, governing board. And it was understood that these were not official officers of the church, but a temporary body. So people who were called to serve until we were able to ordain our first set of officers. And so that was agreed upon in 2012. But then I'm looking here in the historical documents. In October of that year, 2012, session agrees to allow EM to elect their first set of ordained deacons and also to vote myself to be an associate pastor by the end of 2014.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't like, oh, you can vote, Pastor Paul in that year. It was, no. The plan, see, I just want people to realize how thoughtful this was. Like, it wasn't just do whatever you want. It was, okay, here's the timeline. And so this required patience from us as well, right? So you can elect your deacons. I believe that was going to be done fairly soon after the decision was made. But in terms of my, joining the session, becoming an associate pastor, that had to wait an initial 2 years. Okay, and there were reasons behind that, but so it was again a gradual, organic process of growing and partnering together. And at the end of that year, 2012, that's when the bylaws of the church were amended, right, to reflect this vision. So I believe 2012 was a very pivotal year for sure. That's also the year I think Pastor Jacob came on as our youth pastor. So
I like that. So I guess like a little recap. 2009, you came in. That same year, you and Pastor Park kind of established that this is the kind of vision you want for the church: 2 congregations, 1 church. 2012 is when, quote unquote, EM kind of proved themselves a little bit, grew a little more responsible.
We grew up, yep.
And then bylaws were changed. Steering team was formed. And then 2014 was when you officially became an associate pastor.
Yes.
So throughout all these years, and I guess like this is for Elder Daniel, like, did you see that this was kind of all coming to fruition? And because you were here when Pastor Paul came in, and you saw the church growing. And
it was a long process. It took a lot of time, but then being able to witness the growth of EM from humble beginning, if I may, and then to what we have today, it's such a blessing to witness that. And I think, as Pastor Paul mentioned, it takes 2 parties to partner.
Yeah.
So KM side and EM side both, I think, came to a conclusion that we need to, respect one another as separate ministries. And if you think about like child and parent relationship, when their child is younger, the parents support 100%. But then as child grows to be teenager and young adults, then it become a partnership. And then maybe the parents get older, and maybe EM end up supporting KM later on, right? So basically, that's the model I'm thinking about. For me, having attended EM services at other places before, it is rare to see healthy and kind of thriving partnership at Korean American churches. So I think the one we have here is something special. We have like 3,000, 4,000 churches, but very few with the healthy relationships. So credit to Pastor Paul and EM leadership. and also KM, my predecessors who were able to foster that relationship at the same time.
Right, because they were clearly there supporting the growth of EM during that time too.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, so this is all like very important because even from my standpoint, that's like hearing this for the first time from like in this kind of way, even I have like a much better understanding of how rich the relationship between EM and KM had been and how long all of this has been established and the hope for where it could be like has always been there. So
Yeah, one funny anecdote was when I started seeing EM having golf tournament instead of basketball tournament, I knew the time has changed. Aging members, you know,
We still have our basketball tournaments.
for younger people, yeah. But
all right, so now that we have a lot of the history and the understanding of the relationship down, I want to get into kind of dissect into the relationship itself. And I want to ask some harder questions, which are between Elder Daniel, as you mentioned, it is rare, even from what I have heard and seen, for KM and EM to thrive together. In what way do you think first make a relationship like that so difficult?
so I'll start and then other people can chime in. I think it really centers on leaders. So I've seen examples where they have like perfect bylaws and perfect like protocols all in place, but when two leaders don't agree or don't see eye to eye, none of those matter. So I would give it to Pastor Park and Pastor Paul, somehow working this out as two different leaders of different congregations. I think to me that's the first and foremost.
Yeah, anything that you've witnessed, Elder Wooj?
Difficulties, you said, in partnership.
Yeah, I mean, you're part of the sessions too, so
Yeah, of course.
Or positive.
Yeah, I think some of the natural, just the natural challenges that come to mind, obviously, are even though we're all Korean American, cultural differences, that we're steeped in different traditions, even something as simple as language, right? I mean, that is what sometimes makes the second generation, first generation parental and child relationship difficult as well. So I think those come into play in church as well. And even though we share the same space, there's still when you say two congregations, it still is two congregations, right? And so the way we worship, our worship expression is different. I mean, Elder Daniel is dressed really dapper. I am in a North Face
I came from work.
neon shirt.
Came from my office.
Sometimes this looks like our session meetings, right? I'm like, I got to go shopping because I don't want to look bad in front of. I call them like the mafia because all the KM elders are always dressed really nicely. But actually, as a PK, I'm used to that. All the officers are always dressed nicely. But anyway, all that to say that we certainly have differences that come to play when we bring forth a certain level of expectation. And I guess without getting too into it, I think for me, just coming into the eldership, I think what I've had to do is learn to get to know the KM leaders, just their tradition and their culture, but also them as people as well. And that takes some time. And if that's something maybe I can get into later, but that I've come to appreciate. And but certainly there are differences, just some of those obvious ones that come to mind.
yeah.
It is a hard relationship, and I don't know. I have a sort of a nuanced perspective. I personally I sympathize with all of the EM pastors I know who had left the Korean church, for whatever reason. Okay, after a year, after 2 years, whatever. Because in most cases, it's just not a healthy environment for a pastor. And so, there's so many reasons why someone would want to leave. And I think what made our church leadership really embrace the vision is because perhaps, Pastor Park, as you know, his temperament is very mild-mannered, and he's a peacemaking, peace-seeking man. And I think, that's all credit goes to God ultimately, but that's how God made him. And so I think he was the right man for the moment. Okay, and also in my case, for some reason, I mean, we're very different people, like almost the opposite, and maybe because we're the opposite of each other, it works somehow, you know.
Complementary,
Yeah,
right,
like-
Elder Daniel?
Right, couples.
I think that might be at least one of the keys, but also if I think about my own background, because I spent some time in Korea, and I have over the years built an affection for the Korean church. This is one thing I also shared before with Pastor Jacob. Like I told him, probably on more than one occasion, like if you really want to serve in the Korean church long term, you have to actually love the Korean church in some way,
Yeah.
have an affection for it, and so I think that was a part of who I was coming in, and I felt indebted to the Korean church as well in some way because I benefited from its ministry, especially through my college years, and knowing the Korean culture better than most of my peers, I think I was able to endure a bit better,
Yeah.
even as I'm facing the same hardships and difficulties and frustrations of dealing with KM leadership. Okay, and so I think the combination of those things allowed Pastor Park and myself to kind of swallow our pride and move together for all these years.
Yeah, it just shows how much God loves KPCW. Like he put the two right people together at such a time. So it's actually really encouraging to hear.
Amen to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I ask about the difficulties first because I think I would like for our listeners to understand that it wasn't easy and that at times it isn't easy because of the cultural differences, but
Yeah, it was not easy. There were many arguments, even public controversies, fights that people witnessed, and which had led to apologies publicly. And so it was not an easy process for sure.
yeah, and so maybe this is the part where Elder Wooj, you can get into your relationship. What you were mentioning before, how you could get into it a little later about how, like, what are some things that you have gained and learned and grown in through your time of being an elder amongst KM elders too.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. Where do I start? Okay, so let me maybe flesh out a little bit of the dynamic here, and I do think our joint session is unique, as I've been told, and I can kind of sense it in the room too. So Casey and I are the EM elders along with Pastor Paul, and in some ways, I view myself as I'm an advocate, and the main interest is of our EM congregation. So if you look at elders from a biblical perspective as shepherds, right, or even ruling elders, to a certain degree, we have this responsibility God has given us to oversee our congregation, the well-being of their spiritual well-being, right, which includes many facets, right? So I, in some ways, first and foremost, look at our EM congregations, the people that I know by name, as, okay, how do we lead them well as a panel, as a group, right? So it's natural that Casey and I would think about the EM congregation. And in the same way, I think the same probably would hold true for the KM elders. And in fact, the opinions they voice in the room and the concerns that they voice, it's from the KM congregation perspective. And what we then have to do is hear each other out, obviously, and have a certain level of appreciation for the needs of each congregation. And so when we think about the worship space, which that's multifaceted in that, we have certain limitations, right? Just purely in terms of space and campus size, there's just an obvious limitation, which naturally presents problems. And there was already a set order. But even with something like that, naturally it's this is our needs and this is our perspective, and KM is saying the same. And how do we what's the right word? Like, how do we compromise on that, right? I don't know if compromise is the right word. And I think many a times as I've been thinking that, and sometimes I'm like, obviously I have this very EM-centric mind, right? I'm like, well, that doesn't help us any, right? Like how does that solve anything for us? And I think one thing I've had to keep in mind is this, and this is something Pastor Paul has also echoed, is as I sit in the room with these men, I think ultimately, even though we are representing our congregations, we are in that room for the gospel mission, for the mission of the universal church, meaning that the local church, our KPCW church, is an expression of the gospel mission to make disciples of all nations and be a place, because knowing that this world despises the word of God, be a place that really preserves the word of God, the gospel, knowing that that's the beacon that's going to change people's hearts and bring them in. And so I look at Elder Daniel and go, that's ultimately, I would like to think that's ultimately what he's here for, in an ultimate sense, right? And so I've had to remind myself of that. And as that becomes the overarching theme, as I look across and I have disagreements and I go, I don't quite understand where Elder Bay's coming from, for example, right? Or Pastor Park. I've come to appreciate that, like the that's why we call each other kind of brothers in Christ, right? We're in the same walk together. And I think that's helpful. And as we kind of keep talking on this topic, I think that's helpful not just for us as elders, but as members of the church to remember, because it is true that there are members of our church that don't know the KM, members. They don't feel it, wedded to them in a way, right? We're separate, just to be completely honest. We rub elbows at best, right? And so they might have this thought of, why are we forcing this relationship? But from our perspective, it's different, a little bit different. And I think as we commit more to this vision, hopefully, and we see how this partnership works out, I think that's something I would like to encourage our members to think about is, yes, we are different in culture and generations and language barrier, certainly. But in this sense, we are brothers and sisters in Christ, united by the same mandate given by God to be Christ followers who spread this gospel. And the church is the safe haven where we preserve this word of God, right, together. And so I think we can be united in that way. And I kind of have come to appreciate that because I see little bits of that in the KM leaders, like their expressions. I was going to share this later, but as I end, let me share this. As we were working through a lot of our discussions, we've had many about, for some of our members, this might be sudden, but for us as an eldership, this has been a long time coming in a way.
Pre-COVID.
Yeah, starting pre-COVID.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Before I became an elder, so Pastor Paul probably has a fuller perspective, but even the minute I became an elder, I think in some ways this was always kind of in the forefront. And so this has been building and crescendoing, and recently I remember, we were having a session meeting. Most of the time, Pastor Park starts the meeting with a little devotion. And I remember this because he had me read the English version, and he'll always have a Korean elder read the Korean version. And it was Ephesians 3. I think it was Ephesians 3 because he had told me to read it. It was one verse. It was like such a short verse, and it's make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace, right? And so there's not much ambiguity in what he's trying to have us devotion on. There's no much expositing necessary there, right?
Yeah.
And sure enough, I don't really know what he said really, but it was something to the aspect of unity. But it was memorable to me because I could sense the heart behind Pastor Park, which was his genuine attempt to look at us as elders and give us respect and say, look, as much as possible, I would like to keep this unity together. And that made an impression on me. So little things like that, I think, is it because he's proud of the two congregation, one church model? Probably yes, in some sense. Yeah. But I think it's just like we want to walk together in this mission to spread the gospel. Yeah. Like that's how I took it, right? So these things as an elder, we see in the room and maybe our congregation doesn't see. But I think that's what, these are things that weigh in when it comes time to make that one vote that I have or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for some people, it may feel and look like very slow-moving process, but maybe it is for some things. But as Elder Wooj just mentioned before, and Pastor Paul, we've done this in very methodical manner. That it's soliciting many opinions and maybe too much sometimes, but for the sake of the unity, like you said earlier. So, and then also the common vision of the church. Yeah. And I guess some of the EM members would not know, but this is the Korean version of the KCPW House of Vision thing that you probably have seen before. So
he's holding up a little diagram.
Yeah, you probably can't see it. So it's on the church webpage. I think, we focus on like three things as a vision of the statement, which is, worship with inspirational worship. It's in Korean, so I'll try to translate. And then we focus on waking up the layman Christians, right, and train layman Christians. And then we're going to focus on the saving of the souls together. So I feel like for the sake of unity, if we can accomplish these things together with EM and KM partnership, then I think it will be a great story for our congregation and even like future generations in my mind.
Yeah, I love how you guys both just went into that, because that was my next question, which I don't have to ask anymore, which was, how should our congregations view our role? How should we think of this two congregations, one church? Because especially we're going to be getting into the transition soon, but when it comes to thinking of the KM, yeah, for sure, most of the EM members who didn't grow up in the church like you did, Elder Daniel, they have zero like relationship or understanding of what KM has done, which is why I think this episode is so important. But now with this understanding, I would have liked for you guys to do kind of like that little call.
Word for the members, or word to the members?
Yeah, like, so you guys have been having these meetings and talking about this transition and growing this relationship together. But, for the EM members or attenders even, like, we haven't been. So how should we, like, what should our approach be? And you, Elder Daniel and Elder Wooj, you guys kind of answered that when it comes to, I guess, the partnership that we should look at it as.
Yeah, I guess I'll start, and you guys can chime in. Well, but I mean, these brothers shared a lot. I was as they were sharing, I had a lot of thoughts also flowing through my mind. But then now I lost track. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, to be honest, in terms of like what a member should do. Like, if they don't agree with the vision of the church, then that's really between them and God to decide if they want to move on elsewhere. But I guess our hope is that they would at least understand where we're coming from and have an appreciation for what the Lord has been doing in our midst, and I guess in some way that they would trust us, that would trust our judgment. Because as these brothers shared, it was not an easy process. Like, honestly, even the EM leadership, we were really close to just concluding, okay, maybe we need to go on our own, right? And break this partnership up because we don't see a good option for us. And there was, I would say, significant pushback from the KM not wanting us to do this swap of sanctuaries. And it's because, I mean, they have a rich history. They poured their blood and sweat, and they've invested so much of their treasure in this property.
1965.
And for them to give up their space, it's like almost like sacred space for them, like in their minds. So it was not an easy thing. So we understood that tension they were feeling. Like, they knew, okay, we need to support the next generation, but a part of them was still wanting to live through their glory days of their own personal or their own ministry revival, right? And hoping that time would return. And so we sense that tension. And so having heard much of that narrative, we said, okay, maybe this is not going to work, right? And so that's when I think what really inspired me was Pastor Park showing some strong leadership. And I personally believe that he did something that I have not seen him do before. Okay, and I can't mention all the details, but he actually put his foot down firmly and pushed back against some of the opposition that he was facing, and basically, as Elder Wooj sort of said, I mean, the exact words he said was "같이 갑시다." Right? He echoed the motto, I believe, was that's used in the Korean Army, wanting to maintain their partnership with the U.S. Army. Like, let's go together, basically, to translate. Let's go together. And when I heard that, I also heard that he's going to basically, stand his ground and not compromise on this, because I knew the pressure he was feeling in that moment. And so that actually, it touched Elder Wooj. It's like, okay, I see what he's doing. And so I think my thought was I want to give this a try too, because the Lord has blessed His partnership for this many years. Let's at least try this for a good year. That's what Elder Daniel had proposed initially in our meeting, and see where this goes. So we're doing our best to honor the partnership that God has established, even though it may take some time and require some patience. But we believe as the EM leadership that this is the best way to move forward. This is the best way to fulfill the Great Commission. Okay, that wasn't as clear prior, because in our minds there is a responsibility to follow the Great Commission mandate. Okay, to make disciples of all nations, right, and do what's best for the larger church, right, with the big C. And then you have, maybe a perspective that would say, let's just do what's best for our ministry, okay, or let's just do what's best for our local church, okay. So there's tension depending on what you emphasize. And I as an older pastor now, I think my priority needs to be, let's do what's best for the larger body of Christ with a big C, and then underneath that, let's do what's best for the local church. And even underneath that, it's let's do what's best for our ministry, okay? And so I've always held those priorities in place. Yeah. So, but even with that, I've concluded, at least in this moment, that the best way to fulfill the Great Commission is to maintain this partnership for the time being. And so my word to the members is, yeah. please hear me out and do your best to understand, and I'm asking you to trust the leadership.
Yeah, for sure. What would come more naturally as a Christian in this area, even like specifically Korean American in this area, there are a lot of Korean American churches. But I think that the character of KPCW, having this desire to fight for this relationship, is not only what makes this church unique in my eyes, but almost very admirable too. To pursue something that's difficult for the name of God, for the name of spreading the gospel, to respect and honor the KM that has started this church, when most other EMs would break off, there is, there's something almost grand and epic about a story like that we're in right now. So, yeah, I think that's neat.
Yeah, just to that, I think it's not going to be edifying glorifying the people in this room per se, but there might be a reason that God put us together as a partnership between KM and EM, and might be the big C that you mentioned, or for something else. Like a story like this can really touch a lot of people's minds. Like this can be possible, that we can partner like this in other places of this country maybe. And I'm also thinking, the word I was thinking a lot about is like the family, God's family together. And sometimes family have infights, right? Between kids, between parents and whatnot. But when we are able to work that out between family members, good things happen. Yeah. And the stronger bonds, the bond of the family is nothing that really can match in terms of strength and power and everything. So I feel like we're in the process of that, making that bond stronger with the common goal and vision. Yeah, we learn lessons and everything, but I feel like by God's grace, we are at a great point at this time. And this is for EM congregation, because I don't think K members will listen to podcasts like this. So EM members,
burn it on a CD.
AI technology
Burn a
can
CD.
translate everything now pretty well.
That's right, simultaneous translation. But I think I appreciate EM members bring the energy to the KM building for the first 2 weeks, and hopefully the KM congregation will provide some stability and kind of solid foundation of worship and everything. And this will be great partnership in a smaller scale, just like Sanctuary Swap, but even bigger than that, maybe beyond this point.
Yeah, let me take a little bit, two things. I'm hoping maybe I'll unveil a little bit of our thought process, at least from the EM side. I'm hoping it's encouraging and edifying to those, because I feel like some people might have a question. I think Pastor Paul alluded to it a little bit. But during this whole process that has been, for us at least, from my perspective, kind of years in the making, I do want people to know that I think we did really genuinely explore a lot of possibilities, okay? And I say that because Elder Daniel knows. From something as small as literally drawn up architect sketches of what could be possibly done on campus in between the space to looking at.
I have those blueprints.
Shout out to Ben Hung.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Davina is part of this as well too. Like looking at other properties and maybe for a split second dreaming like what would it look like here, or lease spaces. I mean, we explored a lot, right? But what from my vantage point, what is clear is this is just from I think a lot of it has to do with our staff, but I don't want we've been talking a lot about the leadership. It's because I think God uses the leadership to drive and accomplish certain things in the local church, for sure. That's undoubtable. And so it's their faithful monthly, weekly, yearly service. And as our ministry is building, I think in some ways I see this crescendo, right? To a point where we're at a point in our ministry where I look at this, I've said this to our session, is we're at a point in our ministry either way where there's always work to be done, but there's going to be work to be done, no matter what path we chose.
Right.
Okay? If we would have chosen a radical path, not only would there be consequences to our relationship with the KM and the effect that it would have to the KM, but by no means would it have been a clear-cut, easy path either. It would have required a lot of labor. It would have caused, in some ways, differing opinions and division and things that would have required just kind of charging through. And there's a certain amount of boldness that would have been required. And I think that's where we're at our point in our ministry as we kind of get to this mid-size church hurdle, and that's just been really God's doing. I honestly feel like that. We look at, I'm kind of Elder Daniel's counterpart. I help the EM finances, and it just crescendos every year. The generosity increases, of course, but it's really God's doing. And so we are at this point. The way I look at it is some of it is daunting to me, if I'm to be honest. And just like everyone else, my natural inclination is just, I want to just live my life quietly. I don't want much attention, actually. And yet, for some reason, we are in this position, and I think God is saying there's some work to be done, and this is your chance to love the church well, right? And in Corinthians, it talks about different body, right? We all have our different giftings and different roles, right? Some of our... And I think it requires all of us. I want all of the members to not just, they have to trust us, but everyone is required to, they have the opportunity, I should say, to love this body well through this season, which will bring challenges, right? There's a lot of great things, a lot of things that we've talked about how beautiful this relationship is. But nonetheless, even as we look forward, there will be challenges for sure on both sides. Some compromise, some just kind of giving each other benefit of doubt. I'm sure there will be. And I think in those seasons, I just want to urge, I guess, encourage our members, because Pastor Paul is right. At the end of the day, we are accountable to God first and foremost, So this chance to labor together, to remind ourselves that in the midst of our busy lives where we're doing a lot of good things with our families, it is worthwhile work to serve your local church. Most of us, I always say this, most of us aren't going to I don't mean this in a down way, but we're not going to be doing like historic things, right? Just mundane things. But to love your church well and wherever God has placed you, to do that faithfully is I think, worthwhile. And looking back at your life, I think that's something you could hopefully say, hopefully that honored you, God. You know what I mean? And so I think this is our chance, So that's something I want to convey. And there are many of our members who are doing this. And if you are, wondering, I think there will be opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say. So
Can you translate it into Korean now?
you could. That's your job.
All right, you guys, we have to get a move on into the actual transition. There's a lot to talk about there,
I thought we were done.
Yeah.
No, we're like halfway done. But all such great, worthy things to say. And it now, if anything, it really sets up for this transition. And as many of you know, except you, Elder Daniel, I was not happy originally with this decision, because I personally did feel like when the announcement was made that we were going to swap with 9 a.m., that it came really abruptly. Although I knew that size was an issue or space was an issue, and I share this because I know that there are a lot that felt the same way too in the EM, on the EM side. So
Name names. Who?
Davina. But then, which is why, understanding the history is so helpful. So I would love for you guys to kind of share how this decision came to be and why it did kind of feel that it was sudden.
I can't start because everybody's jumping in to speak something. I guess a lot of this discussion had happened behind the scenes, like Elder Wooj said before. And I think the reason being was we didn't want to prematurely share things until it became like somewhat final, so we can actually move forward. Because between KM and EM elders, discussions, a lot of things had changed. Like, shall we just do that? Shall we actually? We talked about moving KM service to 8 a.m.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then we don't have to go to EM facility, and EM can come at 9 o'clock, something like that too, because some people did bring up the point where EM building, chapel, has stairs, and some of our older KM congregation would have a hard time coming up.
Yeah.
But when I look back about the processes, I felt like sharing happened at the right time and give us some heads up along the way. And in a way, I had some concerns. What if none of the KM members would be behind this thing? But I felt like we trusted God's provision in this whole process, and I was hoping and praying that people would be coming around after things happen at that time with the proper communication. So maybe feel bad that people felt it was abrupt change in a way, but maybe it was because there's a methodical process and somewhat in the name of we didn't want to prematurely share things ahead of time. I don't know, you guys want to add anything to that?
I don't know. I'm personally surprised that it felt abrupt because it felt like forever for us. And I thought I had done a pretty good job updating you, Davina, but I guess not.
Yeah, I think it was one of those. Okay, so it wasn't abrupt in terms of like the actual solution was surprising, but I think it's kind of been like this talk for years. Oh, this could be an option. Oh, that could. Okay, we could.
I don't know. I think that could have very well been because Pastor Park, again, he decided to put his foot down in that decisive moment. Because we were simply waiting for Cam to give us an option all those years. I mean, this was a multi-year waiting period for us.
Right.
We said, okay, this option, how about this option? Was back and forth. We proposed something, got rejected. They counter-proposed, and then we thought it was going to work out, but then no, we had to wait a little longer. And so finally, again, it was just waiting for the CAM to approve something. And so once they did, we said, okay, it's not ideal because people were concerned, especially in our staff. Pastor Xiang was very concerned. And it's like, is this really worth it? It's going to work. He didn't really believe in the 9 o'clock service working. Okay. But he's in the background now, giving me
us a
stank guy.
Not calling him out.
He's giving me a stank guy.
Devil's advocate.
But
Hater.
I think I asked him recently. Now do you see it possibly working? He said maybe. He softened up. So yeah, for us it was just a matter of waiting, and this was the only option available. So we
to make this partnership work.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I thought the 9 o'clock. After actually hearing some other scenarios of other churches having like a really early service as their main service, I thought maybe this could work for us too. Yeah. So that was my perspective.
So then, yeah, kind of going back, I actually agree with Xiang too. I'm ultimately, personally, and I know for like long-standing members that are also really loyal to the church, it is the reason why so many of us are on board with this is exactly what you guys have been describing about the relationship. We also want to respect and honor this relationship because, yeah, KM did like 1965. I didn't even know that. Like for this whole time has carried this church. So, but I think I still want some answers. So another one is why 9 a.m. Why was it that? Why did it have to be that time? And kind of like, what's the thought behind that?
You mean 9 a.m. for the EM members?
Okay, so the only two possible options for us was KM holding an earlier 8 o'clock service at their current location and then squeezing us between their 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. service. Okay, or possibly creating more room and maybe pushing back their 11 a.m. till a little later, so we can squeeze in like a 9:30 service or so. But we thought that although the time like 9:30, it sounds a little more appealing. It wasn't worth being squeezed in between two services because we knew we needed time to set up and prep the worship team, etc. And so, like in our minds, 9:30, 9, it really didn't make much of a difference. And so we prefer 9 o'clock. Okay. Now, of course, ideally, we would, love to see, a better time slot offered. But again, in our context currently, it's not possible. So,
Pastor Paul described some of the decision-making process before, and when we kind of felt like it's impasse, like this kind of, none of the decisions were made, Pastor Paul put his foot down, and I suggested, why don't we just give it a try for a year and see what happens? So the session gracefully accepted the proposal, so that we should just give it a try. 9 o'clock, EM will be coming worshiping in the main sanctuary, and then KM will go over to the chapel to worship. And so far, so good in my mind. And then we will learn lessons along the way and then apply to the future decisions. So it's not going to be far-fetched in my mind, Davina. Once we have lessons learned, can we think about, through the partnership, looking for like new venue altogether, so that EM not only will have a better place to worship, but KM will benefit of like doing this partnership along the way.
Okay.
So that's not far-fetched to me. But we just need to focus on making these changes work for the time being, and maybe give it a year or two, and then we can, do the lessons learned.
now it's 2 years, huh?
We just extended on this
3.
podcast.
Did I say year or so?
I see how this works.
I think I said year or so, but maybe 1 year. Okay, 1 year. Let's 1 year.
2 or 3.
Yeah, a year. Okay, so but I think the focus right now is like making this changes work, and then we'll get the lessons learned along the way.
Would you say that, so kind of even just going back to the history, there was this established, 2 congregation, 1 church, and then it was, but let's see if you can make the benchmarks. And then as those were met, things started becoming more established. Do you think we're kind of like at another phase like that, like kind of beginning again when it comes to like now handling space and EM and KM entering like a newer kind of relationship than before?
I personally think so, and I think this is when we talked about like KM supporting EM phase to like partnership, and one of the benefits, kind of like side benefits to me, having this sanctuary swap, is KM members now can see like really how EM can worship, like vibrant, energy-filled worship, and that hopefully rubs off on like KM ministry as well.
Yeah.
So some of other things we want to hope to get out of this is when this is somebody mentioned to me at the 9 o'clock service, Elder Daniel, I was in tears seeing this many kids running around sanctuary at 9 o'clock. Yes, and then somebody said, if this had like EM had this many people for 9 a.m., why don't we do this earlier?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's the comments I received, and hopefully this kind of like they don't know until they see it.
Can we get names?
Wow, nice.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think those things can happen when they actually see the visual examples of energy and all that, and hopefully EM will get those kind of things as well by seeing KM worship and stuff like that along the way. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Davina, I think we don't have clear-cut answers for you or the listeners right now. I think there's still much to pray about and kind of lean on the Lord through. But I think, just succinctly put, I think from an EM perspective, we were at a point where we knew it was getting to that point where we had to make some kind of decision due to space. And I think our 9 a.m. First Sunday service kind of shows that. It's that that number one issue was the space issue, right? So at least in this year, it gives us this opportunity to potentially even grow, but essentially accommodate our ministry, for lack of a better term. And I think in some ways, I think KM also wanted to see that need, even though we had done our best to express that no, we're way beyond that point. But nonetheless, I think, and again, you can edit this if you need or whatever. But I think just at the end of the day, that dynamic of KM needs and KM avocation and EM needs and EM avocation, and the tension of that is still at play. You know what I mean? Just for a lack of better term. And even though Elder Daniel's here, I think we don't need to beat around the bush about that. Like, that's still at play. So what does the future hold? We don't know. We are at a point, though, we have to respect the fact that they're the primary owners of this place. So we can't kick them out, right? So it was up to them to give the gesture of what do you want. And so the 9 o'clock was because that was what they were willing to offer us. And we took it gladly because at least it alleviates the space issue. And as we hopefully now are at a point where we could, at least now we're not limited by the space in terms of certain things we want to do as a ministry, and these side benefits that Elder Daniel said of rubbing elbows together, that hopefully could be an encouragement to each congregation. But what does the future ultimately hold? I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure we all have our ideas and thoughts, but we'll see.
Yeah.
I think there's some aspect of that, just to be honest.
Yeah. And I actually really appreciate that honesty too. That's actually something that I really like about our church. We're very transparent from our finances.
Yeah.
We all know how much you make, Pastor Paul.
So the answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
Let's wait and see.
Yeah, and the relationship is still, you guys are still talking things through, and I like that picture that you shared too, with how families, like, they do have these inner fights sometimes, and that's what family is, and so I appreciate that. 9 a.m. service, I shockingly went to both, the first and second. I wake up really late on a regular basis, but because Sings Up was serving, we had to get to church at 8 a.m. First Sunday, I didn't even see Pastor Paul there. I was at church before Pastor Paul.
Wow.
Which is crazy.
I've been coming a little late because of my leg issue.
Yes, but so we got there early, and then I was surprised myself to see how the church responded. When looking across the KM sanctuary, every side was filled. And so it's very encouraging to see how, even if some members or attenders may be like, oh, we don't really know what's going on, there is this, like, clearly there is this, like, a desire to be together and to move forward together. So for the EM side, 11 a.m. was the bigger service. And so there was this call to ask a lot of 11 a.m.ers to come to 9 a.m. service. There was culture established for both services at this point of our EM ministry. And so I think the reason why I know that for myself and for, like, whoever else that has a hard time with this is having a hard time with this is because of how much that has to change. For example, even the catching up and the lunch after the newcomers, that whole ministry for 11 a.m., that has to be readjusted too. And, like, you know, for people to go over to 9 a.m., it's just how it is. If you go to two different services, you just can't keep up the same relationship that it was. And so, and I bring up these examples in particular because I think these are the biggest things that people are having a hard time with, more than the waking up. And so I just want to ask what your thoughts on it are, and, like, maybe any encouragements and challenges that you have.
Yeah, you know, we understood that there was going to be sacrifice that had to be made by our members, and I think that's the part that really prevented us from, you know, wanting to be so gung-ho for earlier time slot. Because again, ideally, every pastor knows that, you know, the later morning is the best for church, is not just how people are. And yeah, we understand how culture is established, and that 11 o'clock service felt much different from 9 o'clock, and so we get that. But, you know, with all that said, I think given, I guess in our minds, given the partnership that the church has enjoyed between KM and EM, I guess the way the pastors have been processing it, as well as the elders, that there are things in life that you have to prioritize over others, and I think it might make things more inconvenient for members. Like, yeah, okay, you can't enjoy the same sort of relational rubbing of shoulders the way you used to, or you can't enjoy, the routine of, having lunch right after service the way you used to. But I think those obstacles can in some ways be overcome. I mean, it requires some adaptation. It requires some sacrifice. And also at times it just requires just a recalibrating of the mind and just maybe recommitting yourself to something new. Okay, and that's not a bad thing always. And I think perhaps this could be good training for people too. The fact that we don't want to be people who are so fixated on one kind of I guess of cultural affinity. But I mean, this is something that I really wish that our CAM older members would understand as well. Like, if you really want to invest in kingdom work, you really have to be flexible. You have to be willing to adjust and sacrifice your preferences, right, for the, I guess, the edification of the larger body of Christ. And I think that's an important quality to have as a ministry. And so I guess my answer in short would be, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but try to see the big picture. And I think a lot of beauty can still come out of this, right, if you choose to sacrifice and just recommit yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I think just concur with what Pastor Paul mentioned. And in my simple response would be, let's give it a chance. Give it a chance. Give it a try, and see how that evolves over the years.
Yeah.
1 year. Sorry.
Years.
1 year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's succinct enough. I think there's no easy answer here. It's kind of similar to what I was saying. It's the call to love our church despite the circumstance. And before I came here, I was like, okay, well, is there anything I could prepare? And there's this verse in 1 Peter 4, and it's a call to unity, call to good stewardship of your gifts for the church. And the context there is it's the first generation church, or first century church who's under persecution, right, by Nero. And the call here is to this church is like, you guys, I know you guys are different. You guys aren't acting like everyone else, and you're persecuted for that, and you guys are different. But the way you overcome it is by loving one another. Is by he lists a host of things, using your gifts to bless one another and all these things. And I think, in America, I think we sometimes forget that we're very, I guess privilege is the right word, in the freedom to build our church the way we want. And we care so much about how effective our children's ministry is and how it's catered, for lack of a better term, to our needs. And this great fellowship we can enjoy by going to a nice lunch and stuff like that. But like Pastor Paul said, the ultimate, these are all great things, by the way. I love it too. But the ultimate call as a church, like we said earlier, is to join in the ultimate mission. Like, at the end of your life, hopefully you don't look at churches like that's where I hang my hat on is all these, extracurricular activities, but that we played our part to build a church, for His glory, and then we find these hidden gifts from that, the joy, I guess you could say, like whether it's our character changes, we're challenged, or these unnatural relationships come, a host of things can come, but there's no other answer, I guess. There's no answer that suits our flesh, I'll say.
I think actually you guys wrapped it up. It was a challenge and an encouragement and a reminder, and all very powerful. And honestly, I feel like we can end it right there.
Yes.
Yeah?
I'm fine with that, yeah.
So did you guys have any other thoughts, though? Anything you wanted to add before we end?
I want to thank Elder Daniel. Honestly, him and the KM elders have been so. I'm the youngest elder there. I genuinely feel like they care about our ministry as well. But still, they have to advocate obviously for their ministry. But I feel that. I hope the rest of our elders feel that. But I think that is why this partnership can work. Yeah. Honestly.
Yes, and I personally want to thank all of the families who were willing to move over to 9:00 service. I know it was not easy for them. Also thank all the directors. So
Yeah.
Hannah and Shin Samonim and Kathleen, Michelle. They've all been really flexible with things, and I know their jobs are very stressful.
Yep.
But thank you all.
Yeah, Pastor Xiong.
Pastor Xiong, of course,
Yeah, we make the decisions and everyone else has to execute.
Pastor Xiong, Pastor Xiong and he who did so much behind the scenes
Yeah.
to make everything work smoothly, media-wise. We know how important sound is,
Yeah.
and so thank
Worship
you
sounds
guys.
amazing.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's the same on the KM side too. There are some volunteers that have had to step up, whether they liked it or not, So, yep.
Right.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for sharing all of your insight, sharing everything you guys know. And in a way, even the relationship that you guys are experiencing and working out at the session level is like kind of like a micro example of how the church can be as well. And you guys are setting that example for us first. And so I hope that all of our church members listening to this, and even like outside of that, like we're challenged and constantly challenged to growing church together.
Yeah. I try to find commonalities when I work with the EM elder side. And three of us have a lot of things in common. I came to three things. We all are, we married way above our pay grade, all three of us. Wow. And second thing, well, Joyce, Mina, and Amanda. I mean, you obviously can see who they are. And then second thing, all three of us are hair challenged. Lack of black color hair and lack of hairstyles.
I like
then
my white hair.
All three of us have been at our church for a long time, and then we love to see our church grow together.
Yeah. As we come to the end of this episode of Living Stones, we hope that you've been encouraged and blessed by this episode about our church history with KM and EM, and our current transition. If you found value in today's episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Remember that you are not alone in this journey. We are members of God's household, united by our shared faith in the Lord and the desire to grow together. So until next time, may God's grace and peace be with you all. Thank you for being a part of Living Stones.